Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see you and your black boxes. Thanks for being with us in whatever capacity you're able. I am Sarah Wolf. I'm the Advocacy Director with the Minnesota Environmental Partnership. And we are joined by the MEP Climate and Energy Cluster today, along with the Energy We Can't Afford Coalition, to bring this discussion on peaker plants and also blue and green hydrogen and what that looks like for us. MEP, the Minnesota Environmental Partnership, is a coalition of about 70 plus organizations across the state, ranging from large to small, covering a wide array of environmental issues. And knowing that the climate and ecosystem crises we face affect everything and everyone. We have several clusters devoted to topics like water and pollinators, mining, the Great Lakes, transportation, and climate and energy. But increasingly, we understand that all of those are completely interconnected, and the silos that they're in, we are working across them continually. I am just now admitting Patty O'Keefe here. I'm hoping she's going to join us. And Patty, you are perfectly timed. I just said something about the Minnesota Environmental Partnership and our Climate and Energy Cluster. And Patty O'Keefe is with the Energy We Can't Afford Coalition.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Sarah. Yep, my name is Patty. I'm an organizer with the Sierra Club, and the Sierra Club, we are part of the Energy We Can't Afford Coalition, which is a coalition of a bunch of different organizations in Minnesota that have all come together to push back against the rush to replace coal generation with gas plants across Minnesota, not just in Excel territory, but up north. And so we have been doing lots of work specifically around Excel's integrated resource plan and pushing on them to drop their plans for the Becker plant, which they ended up doing, which we're really happy and excited about. Felt like a big win, and are also going to be continuing to be pushing back against the gas plant proposal in northern Minnesota and Minnesota Power Territory, and hopefully engaging in lots of discussions about how we kind of attack this issue from a lot of different angles. So happy to be here today.
Thanks, Patty. So you've probably been on dozens of Zoom calls like this before, but it's always a helpful to go to speaker view if you're able to do that. Seth Mullendore and Abby and Shelley are going to be sharing their screens through this presentation, and that's a helpful view. We're going to be, we're hopeful you'll have questions. If you'd put them in the chat as we go, that'd be great. We're going to let Seth, Abby, and Shelley do their presentation and then look at the questions and field those afterwards. So having said that, also just check to see if you're on mute unless you're speaking, and thank you so much. Brett Pence is the Greater Minnesota Director with Interfaith Power and Light. And he was instrumental in working with the cluster to bring this presentation to us. Brett, would you take it from here?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. And I want to really thank MEP for putting this together. I think this is when we educate together, we act together. So I'm really excited for this program to learn as well. I'm just going to briefly introduce CEG and Seth, but I'll let them mainly introduce themselves. I met Seth in 2015 and was introduced to CEG at that point when I was working on Solar Market Pathways, Department of Energy grant, administering that for Equilibrium 3 in the city of Duluth. And CEG was hired to be sort of a technical advisor to all the participants within that grant, along with the likes of groups like IREC and RAP and the Solar Foundation. So, they helped us install a retrofit a advanced battery to a old existing solar installation in need of repair at Hartley Nature Center, and that was a great project. So I learned a lot about the values of this group. They've continued to be a national leader in terms of solar and storage and advocating for resiliency in communities and everything that means, from environmental justice to the technical aspects of that. So when I saw they have a phase out peakers initiative that they'll tell us more about, I thought, because of the reasons Patty already talked to us about, this would be a really great time to hear what they have to say and to learn from them, and to see how folks might be able to participate in this state. So really excited to introduce Clean Energy Group and Seth Mullendore. Seth, thank you.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm going to share my screen here and get things started off. So I am Seth Mullendore, and I am a Vice President for Clean Energy Group. Clean Energy Group, for those of you not familiar with us, we're a national nonprofit energy advocacy organization, and we're working towards a more just, inclusive, and equitable clean energy future through our work. One of our projects is the Phase Out Peakers project. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I'm going to kick us off with kind of a higher level overview of what that project is and our work in the space. And then turn it over to Shelley to talk more about Minnesota. And then finally, Abby is going to talk about hydrogen specifically. So the Phase Out Peakers project is a collaborative effort to support local community groups and environmental justice groups across the country that are battling peaker power plants in their neighborhoods. We got into this about 3 years ago, looking at the opportunities really for battery storage and paired with renewables to serve as viable, cost-effective alternatives to polluting peaker power plants. One of the reasons that we got into this space was not only the opportunity that the drops in battery prices were creating in this space to replace peakers, was the other opportunity here is the environmental justice impact of peaker plants. They are not the biggest fossil fuel emitters in the power sector because they don't operate all the time. But when they do operate, they are less efficient, and they have really significant local impacts due to co-pollutant emissions. Primarily, they emit NOx, so nitrogen oxides, at pretty high levels, particularly older peaker plants, which are often not retrofitted with NOx reducing technologies. So just to start off, to level set, what is a peaker power plant? What are we talking about here? So these are plants that are usually the plants of kind of last resort. They only run during periods of high demand. This can be in summer when there's air conditioning. In Minnesota, it might be when there's a big need for heat in the winter. Folks have electric heating. They are less efficient than other gas plants, which means they have higher emissions per kilowatt hour than other types of gas plants. They tend to be located closer to population centers because they are located usually in load pockets where there's not enough outside transmission capacity to be able to get energy from other sources into load centers where the load is higher. They have a low capacity factor. Capacity factor is how often the plants run over time versus how often they could potentially run. So 100% capacity factor would mean they're running full bore, full power all the time. Peaker plant generally is categorized as something that runs less than 15% of the time. That means that it's running, several hundred hours a year. Often these power plants run 10% or lower. We see a lot of power plants that only run 1% of the time, which is less than 100 hours per year. So they're not used a whole lot. And when they do operate, they're usually not operating for long periods of time. So generally they only operate for a few hours at a time. That's what makes them ripe for replacement, particularly by battery storage. The lithium-ion batteries that have dropped dramatically in price over the last decade. Peakers are a nationwide issue. This came from EIA. It's a little bit outdated, looking to update this map, but it hasn't changed a whole lot. There's more than 1,000 of them out there. The main technologies are either combustion turbines or internal combustion engines. A lot of these are not much different than a jet engine. We are focused a lot on metropolitan regions in our phase out peakers project, not exclusively, but that's again where these power plants are clustered. We did an analysis a couple of years ago looking at the top 10 metropolitan regions and where they were focused. And you can see, we've got hundreds of thousands of megawatt hours of these power plants clustered around some of the major metropolitan areas across the US.
There is an echo on my end that I'm hearing. I don't know if others are hearing it too. So I don't know if maybe everyone just wants to make sure they're muted if they're not speaking.
Yeah, I was hearing that as well. It seems better, but let me know if that comes up again. Just to talk a little bit about our work in this space, we kicked the work off doing an assessment across 8 different states, looking at the opportunities for replacement of peakers with battery storage paired with renewables. And the work kind of has progressed to target into specific locations. We've done a few assessments across the US. The work is really concentrated right now in New York City, which has the highest concentration of peaker plants around a densely populated area in the country. There are 19 peakers in New York City itself. There are more of them on Long Island and in Newark nearby and the surrounding communities. We are part of a coalition called Peak Coalition. This is with local New York organizations, New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, Uprose and the Point CDC, which are both local community-based organizations, and New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. And we have what's now in its 2nd year, a campaign to retire and replace New York City's peaker plants with clean renewables. Through that work, well, here's just to give you an idea of where those are located in respect to environmental justice communities. You see each of those bubbles represents one of the peaker power plants. The closer you get to red, the older they are. Some of these are more than half a century old and extremely dirty. They are all clustered around close by minority communities and low-income communities, and have an extremely detrimental impact on those communities when it comes to air pollution. We've put out 2 reports as part of the Peak Coalition. We do a lot of things, but these reports kind of sum up a lot of the work. The first one was Dirty Energy, Big Money, where we looked at how much are these peaker plants actually getting paid. And this is mainly through capacity payments. So these are our payments just for the power plants to sit there and wait to operate, not even for them to do anything, just to be available. Over a period of 10 years, the 19 peakers, actually looked at 16 for this report, they brought in $4.5 billion. The majority of that went to out-of-state companies, energy companies, and hedge funds that own these power plants. They also found it is some of the most expensive electricity in the United States, 13,000% higher than what New Yorkers pay for their average energy, which is already high on a national standard. So it's extremely expensive power, and that the peakers are significant contributors to nitrogen oxide emissions, particularly during high ozone days, which tend to be hot days in the summer. They can contribute up to 90% of the NOx emissions. Major contributors to respiratory disorders, cardiac disorders, and a contributor to higher rates of COVID infection and mortality rates. The second report that we put out was called the Fossil Fuel Endgame. In this report, we worked with our consultant, Strategen Consulting. They're our technical consultant for this work, to lay out a vision for what it would look like to replace the power plants in New York City. We went in deeper to some of the statistics as well, looking at 3/4 of a million people in New York City live within 1 mile of these peaker plants, and 78% of those are either low income or people of color. But what we really were looking at was the replacement scenario. And we came up with some pretty big numbers for replacing those, a mix of offshore wind, which New York is committed to, mostly rooftop solar and distributed battery storage. All of the replacement that we did find, though, were well aligned with the goals that New York has already put in place, just concentrating a lot of that resource development within New York City. Found that by implementing that mix of resources, you could save $1 billion in energy market costs by 2035, an additional $1 billion in environmental and public health benefits over that same period. We're doing a lot more in New York as well. We're engaged in a couple of direct battles to stop repowering of 2 of these old peaker plants owned by private entities. And we are in a partnership with the New York Power Authority, who owns 6 peakers in the area, to map out a replacement schedule for them. And they have committed to replacing all of their fossil fuel assets with zero emission generation by 2035. This is just a quick look at one of the analyses we did. This was in Massachusetts for a proposed project in Peabody, Massachusetts, a 60 megawatt gas peaker, looking at the relative cost of new entry for the peaker plant that's on the left there versus 2-hour battery storage and 4-hour battery storage. You can see that the 2-hour battery storage came in with a lower capital cost than the proposed peaker project and significantly lower net cost over time. The 4-hour battery was slightly more expensive for an upfront cost, but because it's able to tap into more revenue streams through providing energy services and ancillary services, that over time, the net cost of that power plant was also lower than that gas peaker. At this time, we've not been able to stop that project from going forward, but still fighting that in partnership with MCAN, the Massachusetts Climate Action Network there. So that's going to close out my part of the presentation. We will be happy to answer any questions after our presentations. For now, I'm going to turn it over to Shelley to talk more about what the landscape looks like specifically in Minnesota.
Thank you, Seth. And with this background from Seth, I'll share what we see in Minnesota on the peaker front. We're not here to say you need to do X, Y, Z, but there are a lot of folks already doing really incredible work here. And I'll highlight some of those as we go, but we're more here to take a quick look at Minnesota using some of the resources we have, such as our consultant Stratagen, and highlighting the differences between your regulated utility peakers and your non-regulated utility peakers, and sharing the capability of a brand new EPA tool, an online mapping tool that allows people to change settings and see different types of power plants and the communities that they impact. So next slide. So putting Minnesota in context with the rest of the US, this is similar to the slide that Seth had, but this is using that new EPA tool. And I've got a link to it in the next slide. But you see there are 1,584 coal, gas, and oil peakers. And so on the next slide, this is just Minnesota, coal, oil, and gas peakers. Some of these are industry owned, such as for paper mill or steel mill. There are 85 in Minnesota, and you can see some of the features of this tool on the right. You can see there's a legend that sort of shows what highly impacted populations, low income, communities of color, communities with language isolation, things like that. So we asked our consultant Stratagen to help us narrow down the list to identify which of these are regulated and merchant peakers. And so these are 28 regulated peakers. Don't even attempt to read that. But it's here for you later if you need it. But notice that I highlighted the coal and oil peakers, and I was really surprised actually at how many of those are still left. Those are sort of the gray and the pink in that column are either coal or oil peakers. These are the regulated 28. The regulated plants are owned by utilities that are regulated by the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. These plants are probably scrutinized the most. And there are several groups in the state who put a lot of time and resources into the PUC process. And some of those I just want to give a shout out to are Fresh Energy, Cooperative Energy Futures, Institute for Local Self-Reliance, Earth Justice, Clean Grid Alliance, Union of Concerned Scientists, Sierra Club, Minnesota Citizens Utility Board, and the Minnesota Citizens for Environmental Advocacy. And I apologize if I'm leaving folks out. But the interveners have been able to force Xcel to downscale the gas generation being proposed to replace coal generation at Sherco, for example. And that scrutiny is still ongoing. Next slide. These are your merchant peakers, and they are not regulated by the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. So when you combine the regulated and the merchant, that's about half of that total 85 that we first saw. So the merchant peakers sell directly to communities and or the MISO grid, Mid-Continent ISO. Great River Energy is the state's nonprofit member-owned electric cooperative. And you see they own most of these. They are the second largest power supplier in the state. Their 2021 resource plan update includes adding 200 megawatts of gas peaker capacity, but it also includes working with Form Energy on a 1 megawatt long duration battery storage demonstration project. So I was happy to see that. Now note the ages of the last three Great River oil peakers in bright red, 1978, and their emissions are the highest. And I'm going to take a closer look at two of them in just a minute. So next slide. I mentioned MISO. If you don't really understand much about the ISOs, such as MISO and how they work, our sister organization, Clean Energy States Alliance, has just released a really helpful resource that I wanted to pop in here. So you can access that on the CISO website. It's fairly short, it's very simple, but it really does a great job explaining how those wholesale power markets work. So next slide, back to Minnesota. So we have the PUC regulated peakers and unregulated merchant peakers. Do we have any policy tools to help encourage a cleaner grid? Absolutely. For those peakers that are participating in MISO, we've got FERC Orders 841, which directs grid operators to remove barriers to storage participation in the wholesale markets. And then FERC Order 2222, which directs grid operators to allow distributed energy resources, including solar plus storage microgrids, to participate in the wholesale markets. And right now, MISO is in the process of figuring out how to implement these rules. They're creating the rules and a process for incorporating renewables plus storage. And then the goal is that renewables plus storage and things like demand response start to take the place of peakers on the grid. And then you've got the new ECO Act that expands energy efficiency or lowering energy demand. And it also enables fuel switching when the net effect is a reduction in the amount of source energy consumed. So you switch out your gas furnace to a heat pump. And then there's the Natural Gas Innovation Act, which pushes the needle toward electrification where possible. So from a carbon and emissions standpoint, the clear Minnesota policy goal seems to be to electrify everything, which is great. But what impact does that have on Minnesota's utilities and on peaker plants? Next slide. It means switching from summer peaks, for which solar is really helpful, to winter peaks. And this image is from the Great Plains Institute's recent report on decarbonizing natural gas. And while the focus is on gas utilities and users, they did point out that as we electrify everything, we increase the use of electricity in winter and we shift to winter peaking. Utilities across the country are using winter peaking when there is less sunshine and when it shines kind of at the wrong time, to justify building more gas peaker plants. But as Seth pointed out, batteries can now increasingly do the same thing and at a lower cost. Next slide. Now let's take a look at the peaker plant landscape in the communities outside the Twin Cities. And again, this is pulled from that same EPA tool. You'll see my little pictures, which ones are oil peakers and which ones are gas peakers. There are still a lot of oil peakers out there. And this isn't the whole state, but this was a little surprising. So I've got them listed there. So those are all the peakers that surround the Twin Cities. Next slide. Now we're going to take a look at a couple of those specific examples. This one is Green River Energy's Maple Lake. And again, all this was created using that tool. With its emissions and demographic statistics, there are 3,300 people living around it. 19% are low income. It does not have NOx emissions controls in place, and it's one of the highest carbon and NOx emitters in Great River's peaker fleet. It also has a black start diesel generator, but they only need to run it 0.2% of the time. So when this peaker cranks up and belches out NOx and carbon, who feels the impact? Next slide. The neighborhood right behind it. The blue dot is the oil peaker, and you can see how it is immediately adjacent to a neighborhood. And again, this was, I was able to get this view using that tool. Next slide. This one is Rock Lake. It's farther north than the Twin Cities. There's a population of 4,373 within 3 miles of it, 36% low income. Its emissions are even higher. And what does it look like on the ground? Next slide. The blue arrow is pointing to our dirty oil peaker, and right next door is a school with its track and field, tennis courts, and ball fields. So, and then you can just imagine, okay, when that thing, particularly if it fires up when all the ACs are running on a hot summer day and all the kids are out running track and field and playing tennis and playing ball, what impact that is going to have on their health. So now you have a sense of what kind of information is available at both a very macro level and a very micro level. Who lives next door? So at this point, I want to call attention to some of the grassroots groups in Minnesota who are working in individual communities on a variety of environmental issues. The ones I've learned about include Honor the Earth, Equilibrium 3, the Energy Sense Coalition, Health Professionals for a Healthy Climate, and COPOL, which is organizing in the Latino community, plus our hosts, Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light and Minnesota Environmental Partnership. And I know there are many, many more, but you've got great folks working on the ground. So with all this terrific human and policy, all these assets in Minnesota, what's on the horizon? Well, there will be pressure to get rid of those oil peakers. Utilities will be shifting to winter peaking, and there is pressure to decarbonize gas. So what are the utilities saying about where this is heading? Well, there's talk of battery storage, but also hydrogen is one of the technologies being considered by some of the state utilities. And now Abby Ramanan will explain why we and other experts have serious concerns about wide-scale adoption of hydrogen in the energy sector. Take it away, Abby.
Thanks, Shelley, for that very excellent lead-in. So as Shelley mentioned, one topic we really wanted to make sure we covered in conjunction with peakers is hydrogen. Clean Energy Group first became involved with hydrogen research and advocacy through our work on New York City peakers. As Shelley mentioned, decarbonization and electrification proposals are becoming much more of a reality. And as those same plans fall into place, a lot of those endangered peaker plants are turning to hydrogen blending proposals as a way to supposedly cut emissions. There are about 25 active blending proposals that we are currently aware of in the country. And while Minnesota doesn't have active proposals, hydrogen is starting to be discussed on a number of dockets. So I wanted to just kind of give y'all an overview of the different types of hydrogen and why we're so concerned about its use. So just right off the bat, one thing to highlight is that 95% of hydrogen currently in production is gray hydrogen, which is hydrogen produced by natural gas. That does have carbon emissions because it is produced by natural gas. A lot of what's being talked about now is clean hydrogen, which is being used as an umbrella term to cover both blue and green hydrogen. Pink hydrogen is actually something that I know Xcel Energy has also been looking at, so I'll touch on that in a bit. But blue hydrogen is hydrogen that is produced through the same steam methane reformation process that gray hydrogen is produced through, but the carbon emissions from that production process are captured. So while it's technically CO2 free in the production process, as I'll touch on a little later, there are actually still carbon emissions associated with blue hydrogen production. Green hydrogen is produced through electrolysis, and that electrolysis is powered by renewable electricity. So there are no carbon emissions associated with the production of hydrogen through electrolysis if it's powered by renewable energy. Pink hydrogen, which I don't have on the slide, but just want to touch on briefly, is hydrogen production powered through nuclear energy. So that is again produced through electrolysis, but the electrolysis is powered by nuclear energy instead of renewable electricity. Next slide. So blue hydrogen, when folks are talking about clean hydrogen, they're 95% of the time going to be talking about blue hydrogen because there's just not that much green hydrogen production happening in the US right now. Blue hydrogen has been highlighted as a sort of bridge fuel because green hydrogen production technology is not yet at the scale it would need to be to power all of these supposed kind of hydrogen blending proposals that are being put forward. Blue hydrogen is not actually emissions free in any capacity. There's a recent report that came out a few weeks ago from Robert Howarth at Cornell University and Mark Jacobson at Stanford University that looked at the life cycle emissions of blue hydrogen. And it found that it actually has significantly higher emissions. Burning blue hydrogen has significantly higher emissions than burning natural gas or coal. And the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of blue hydrogen are actually only slightly better than gray hydrogen. Part of that is because there's upstream methane emissions that are normally not captured when folks are looking at life cycle emissions of blue hydrogen. Also, if you're using carbon capture technology, you need natural gas to power that technology. And also that carbon capture technology is not yet really at scale. So the idea that we'd be producing massive amounts of blue hydrogen to begin with is actually a little questionable, given the timeline that most folks are talking about, which is in the next few years. And then also because hydrogen is actually less energy dense than natural gas, it also, if you're combusting it, you need more hydrogen to get the same amount of energy as you would if you're combusting natural gas or methane. So if you were to blend, say, 30% hydrogen to 70% natural gas, you wouldn't get a linear reduction in CO2 emissions that way either. If you were to burn 30% hydrogen to natural gas, you get about a 13% reduction in CO2 emissions to begin with. All of that adds up to only about a 9 to 12% reduction of CO2 emissions between blue hydrogen versus gray hydrogen. So overall, it's not really the cure-all that a lot of folks have highlighted it as. Next slide. So green hydrogen, as I mentioned, does not have the life cycle CO2 emissions that blue hydrogen has. However, there's very little of it being produced right now, and part of that is because of the technology that is required to produce it. There are currently only 2 large-scale commercial green hydrogen production plants in the US, and there's a few smaller merchant plants. And part of that is because green hydrogen requires a ton of renewable energy to be produced. Most electrolyzers have an efficiency about 75%. If you're burning that hydrogen in a power plant, once you produce it, the life cycle efficiency is about 30%, which means you would be losing 70% of the energy required to produce it. And they're working on a next generation electrolyzers that would bring that efficiency up to maybe 45%. But that's still, a huge issue in terms of the amount of renewable energy you would require just to produce the green hydrogen. And then if you're again burning that in a power plant, you're losing all of that energy all over again. And another issue I just wanted to highlight quickly, because it doesn't get talked about as often, electrolysis is also a very water intensive process. So most electrolyzers use about 9 tons of purified water to produce a ton of hydrogen. A lot of that water, if you need to purify it before putting it into the electrolyzer, that purification process usually requires about double the amount of water. So you're looking at about 18 tons of water per ton of hydrogen produced. And that's, again, if you're putting that hydrogen into a natural gas plant, that natural gas plant is going to require cooling. Most natural gas plants require about 300 gallons of water per megawatt hour of electricity produced. Hydrogen, as I mentioned before, it does burn hotter than methane. So while no analysis has really been done as to how much that would potentially increase the amount of cooling water needed, it's likely that you would need more than 300 gallons of water. Next slide. So one of the biggest issues around both blue and green hydrogen, and really all hydrogen that's being combusted in power plants, is NOx. As I mentioned, we got into this work through our work with the Peak Coalition in New York City, and that is because a lot of these polluting peaker plants that have already really high rates of NOx emissions, they were discussing injecting hydrogen into their fuel mix. And the issue with that is that hydrogen, when it's combusted in a power plant, it actually produces 6 times as much NOx as methane. So that's a huge issue if you're already, a peaker plant in an environmental justice community that's faced high levels of NOx to begin with. Having those higher NOx emissions is really concerning. And part of that issue is because most current NOx emissions controls in commercial power plants, because hydrogen is so elementally different from methane and natural gas, most of those NOx emissions controls can only handle pretty low levels of hydrogen blending. The maximum that most manufacturers suggest is 30%. And as I mentioned, that's, you're not going to get a huge decrease in CO2 emissions if you're limited to that level of blending. There are a few 100% hydrogen turbines that have been made. None of those are in commercial operation, but those where they've managed to develop NOx emissions technologies for hydrogen have about the same NOx emissions as a newer natural gas plant. This was really concerning for us in terms of, we're already working with communities that have been heavily impacted by NOx and all of the health disparities that come around that. And so the idea of repowering these peaker plants with hydrogen and then consigning those communities to decades more of increased NOx pollution was really, really concerning for us. And we really wanted to raise that issue. Most blending proposals that we've tracked around the country have not done anything to address the NOx issue. There's limited research going into what needs to be done to advance those controls so they can limit NOx emissions from hydrogen. In most cases, those plants would have to be retrofitted, which has not been addressed either. So the idea that you could just easily inject hydrogen into a power plant and have it reduce your CO2 emissions and not increase NOx emissions is pretty ridiculous. You would need to really consider a lot of other issues before just injecting it into the fuel mix. Next slide. One other kind of concern I want to bring up is just the cost and safety issue. In addition to all the other concerns that I brought up earlier, hydrogen, if it's in steel, it will actually diffuse through the steel alloy and cause little micro cracks, which is a huge issue for pipelines and other kind of steel infrastructure. Again, if you have very low levels of hydrogen, probably less than 30%, more like 15% in a steel pipeline, there might not be an issue, but not a lot of study has been done on at what levels of blending you get those micro cracks, and if it's even safe to really transport hydrogen in the same pipeline as natural gas to begin with. So any plans to like use hydrogen in that context would require replacement of almost all steel infrastructure, and that has major concerns for ratepayers as well. They did a recent study in the city of Chicago that looked at replacing all pipeline infrastructure there, and it was going to cost ratepayers around $750 a year by 2040, and that's really not something that we want to consider for burning hydrogen that isn't actually going to lower CO2 emissions to begin with. It also causes issues in the home. If you are to replace, natural gas with hydrogen, you would have to replace all end user appliances as well, and that would again lead to concerns about NOx emissions in the home. If you were to have like a hydrogen stove or something like that, that would be another major concern. And then finally, it does actually lead to increased risk of explosions because of all these issues. There's a recent study that came out of the UK that looked at if all natural gas was to be replaced with hydrogen, domestic explosions and the resulting injuries from those explosions would actually quadruple. So a lot of major concerns for end users as well, if you're to start burning hydrogen. Next slide. So yeah, just wanted to highlight, we did just launch a hydrogen webpage where we have all of these kind of resources and then links to further studies there. So I included the link, and then I did want to flag, we are actually having a webinar with one of the authors of the Blue Hydrogen Report I mentioned earlier next week. So, if you are interested in learning more about blue hydrogen and concerns around emissions reporting, please tune into that. Thanks.
Okay, that's it. That's the end of our presentation. Here's our contact information. I'm going to stop sharing the screen here in a minute so we can see everyone and look at what questions are out there. I have not been following the chat. I've been looking at the slides. So I know we talked about this. Brett, have you been monitoring the chat at all as far as questions coming in?
Oh yes, lots and lots of questions coming in. I think one of the first ones we received, we did receive some prior to the event, but the first one we received while you're talking was just curiosity about the economics of renewables and batteries comparative, to the peakers in Minnesota, given Minnesota energy prices. So maybe anything you could say about that at this point.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'll say I don't have a great answer at this point because I am not an expert on Minnesota prices. Shelley, I don't know if you've looked at it at all. It's going to be different than what it looks like in New York, that's for sure. What that mix will look like. Batteries tend to be the same across different geographies, and except for actually places like New York where they're more expensive to install. So battery prices will be about the same. It's the renewables that are going to be a big difference. So solar, obviously, for winter peaking is going to be less useful here in Minnesota, whereas something like onshore wind might be more valuable.
I also believe that there was a report that was mandated by, funded by Department of Commerce in Minnesota, and was sent to the legislature in 2019 that looks specifically at this, and I'll find the link for that, get it out to folks. Answer some of those specific questions. Sarah, are you coming on? Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to ask Ellen Anderson, who I think put that question in the chat, if she had any follow-up or anything else to say about that question.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Sarah. I was just typing something because I think Brett was mentioning that the Minnesota Department of Commerce report on sort of what is the cost effectiveness of battery storage in Minnesota. And my view is that it was kind of out of date as soon as it was published. And it's certainly because battery prices are going down fairly fast, nationwide. So I think, battery projects are getting more cost effective in Minnesota. That's all I'll say, even though our electricity prices don't make it quite as appealing as they might in New York and other places. So If I could just add one more thing, I don't know if all of you from your organization, SEP and others, if you're aware that in Xcel's new IRP, Patty mentioned that they dropped the proposal for a big combined cycle gas plant, 800 megawatts, which is great. And that was due to tons of work by all these great organizations you've mentioned. But now they're proposing in their alternate plan 2 new gas peakers. And so that's going to be really important for us to have the most, the best possible evidence we can to show that there are alternatives to that for they're doing that whole black start argument that is now the new black box across the country of, oh, we can't do this because we won't be able to do black start. So anyway, so we're trying to refute that and provide alternatives in the IRP.
Yeah, just thanks, Ellen. It's good to hear your voice again. One thing on that is we are seeing more of these proposals where baseload generation like coal or larger gas plants, when they're being replaced, it is with peaker plants because utilities value that flexibility that peakers can provide as we're seeing more intermittent resources coming into play. And the second point on that, the black start point, this is an argument we see again and again. Batteries have actually been proven to be able to provide black start capabilities. There's even a repowering in New York City where they're keeping 2 of their turbines for black start, which they intend to replace with 24 megawatts of battery storage to provide black start for the new gas peakers that they want to put in as well. So that seems to be a bit of a red herring, the black start argument. You should be hearing more on that, but there hasn't been a lot about batteries providing black start, although it has been proven in places.
Oh, it's funny how to define it. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, basically, it's about what happens when the grid goes down and needing some kind of,
basically zero
rotating mass.
ramping.
Go ahead, you answer. Yeah.
Basically zero ramping, just immediate, something that can bring everything else that ramps up slower, something that gets it all started, and batteries can do that.
Yeah, it's essentially the power to get the rest of the power system back up when you have an outage situation.
This is perhaps a related question that came in the RSVPs, and it was asking, can we use existing gas plants as peaker plants during the clean energy transition rather than building these new peaker plants? Can we use the natural gas plants we already have to serve that function potentially?
Yeah, that's a tricky one because the answer is yes, you can. So there's a trade-off there because the existing ones, a lot of those are going to be some of your dirtier power plants. But do we want to be building a new power plant that's going to be around for at least 30 years to replace that capacity? So a lot of it depends on, I would say, the time frame that you're looking at and the communities that are going to be impacted. But in any case, I think the argument for building new ones, whether it's we have enough existing capacity, we don't need those, or we should be putting in something else like batteries or demand response programs or transmission lines even. There are other ways to tackle this that are very much cleaner alternatives and often cheaper alternatives than building a new gas peaker plant.
Thanks. I have a couple questions about maybe motivations from utility companies at this point, one for the peaker plants and one on hydrogen. Why, when we're in the middle of all the crises we know we're in the middle of and needing to reduce emissions entirely by 2050, why does, and many of you will be able to answer this question, so forgive me for my ignorance here, but is there some benefit to Xcel financially for proposing peaker plants at this juncture as opposed to the renewables and battery solutions that we're talking about?
I'll start with that one, and others can chime in. Rate of return, particularly with the regulated utilities, they are awarded a rate of return on their capital investment. as part of their rate base and the rates that the customers pay. And it's in their interest to continue large capital projects because that's how our system is set up right now. It rewards, at one time, that's what was needed. So it rewards these large capital projects. So they're sort of protecting their revenue stream for their shareholders, and they're protecting their existing infrastructure. So that's a big part of it.
I'll also say
Anybody else?
I'll just say that the utilities are not often rewarded for innovation. Their job, as they see it, and rightfully so, is to keep the lights on for folks. And they know how gas plants work, and they understand them. They know batteries less, and a lot of them will say it's still unproven technology, even though it has decades of experience in a lot of places, and certainly in the power systems, it's got a growing role. So that is one of the problems with how utilities are incentivized, in addition to the return on capital investments, is they're just not rewarded for innovative response, nor are they often rewarded for lowering emissions, even though that is the goal of what I think most of us here are trying to get at.
Looking at that last comment in the chat, resilience, that's an excellent point. In addition to everything else that batteries do, they're also an incredible tool for resilience in things like hurricanes.
And I hope I'm not overlooking other questions, but I'm wondering, after that presentation on hydrogen and all of the downsides that you were sharing with us, Abby, and this was talked about in the chat, but we might as well just talk about it as part of this webinar as well. Why is hydrogen a hot topic right now? Why are we hearing more about it now when it seems to not bring a very big benefit? And it brings lots of drawbacks.
I mean, preservation of assets, I think, is probably the number one motivation we've seen. It's, you know, as I mentioned, you can't actually just inject hydrogen into an existing natural gas pipeline, but that's the way a lot of utilities are seeing it. And, you know, it's just a way to keep existing infrastructure and keep using it. You know, I think a lot of what hydrogen is talked about is for those hard to decarbonize sectors, so heavy industry, industrial heat. And yeah, that it definitely could have a role there, but you know, we don't need to worry about the hard to reach sectors just yet. We have a lot of other issues ahead of that. And as I mentioned, you know, even to just, if we were to switch everything to green hydrogen right now, we don't even have the renewable capacity to do that. I think another big reason people push forward green hydrogen is this idea of using up excess capacity of renewables. And you know, a lot of the times that excess capacity doesn't actually exist, or it's an interconnection issue. And, you know, hydrogen might not be the best use of that excess capacity.
And it can be stored in batteries and dispatched when needed.
Yep. This is Brett. One question we received prior to this event about this was a question about just the role of transmission and how it would affect peaker plants. So maybe you could just talk to that a little bit, you know, about those interconnections and yeah, in our energy grid.
Yeah, that's a lot of the reason why peaker plants are where they are, is because of those constraints on the transmission system. So you can't get the energy from where it's being produced to where it's being used because there are bottlenecks. That's why they're called peaker plants, because when peak demand hits and you're going above that baseload generation and the ability of the transmission system to get the energy where it needs to be. So increases in transmission capacity to those load pockets can bring in that energy and can solve the peaking needs. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to get transmission lines built these days, and it can be a long process. But in New York, the utility there, Con Edison, has proposed a new transmission line into New York City, and that's negating the need for several of the peaker plants, one of which is trying to get repowered. So we think we have a pretty strong argument that it shouldn't be. But one of their arguments is that oh, the transmission line could be delayed and then we'll be short on capacity. So the transmission is a great way to tackle this. If you have enough generation capacity somewhere else, by all means, that's a good way to get at it. But there are realities, and in fact, it's hard to site new transmission lines, particularly when they're going across states or large regions of a state.
And then there are other tools that utilities don't get to earn as much on, such as demand response and demand side management, that can be used to shave those peaks. And I don't think we're seeing enough usage of those tools by the utilities either.
I see we're kind of coming up towards the end here, and there are other questions, and I'm sorry we're not going to get to them. I believe we're going to be able to send the slides out and links afterwards. Is that correct? Yeah, I believe that's correct. And but I think maybe ending with the question of what about maybe the ask you would have of working with partners in Minnesota on this issue. So what are some of the things that Clean Energy Group, you know, the data that you could provide and looking at this issue more closely in Minnesota, and what kind of partnership would you be looking at from organizations that would be like to work more on this issue?
Yeah, so Clean Energy Group, we're here as the technical support team for folks. So we have this expertise that we've gathered throughout the years and links to other folks that have additional expertise to bring to bear on engagements that you're involved in, particularly in fighting power plants. So we are here to help provide that support. Now, some of the analytical work that we've done in other places, we may or may not have the funding to support that. So, you know, we may need to do some joint fundraising around that if there is a need for some of that deep technical knowledge where we have to go to outside consultants as well. But on a day-to-day basis, when you're looking for resources or looking for examples to point to where other folks have been tackling some of the things we're tackling here, that's what we're here for. So please consider all of us, myself, Shelley, and Abby, as resources. We're easy to find. It's just our first name at cleanegroup.org. Or you can reach us through Sarah or Brett or others that know us on the conversation today. So, you know, that's what we're here for, is to provide that information. And if there is an interest in making this a bigger campaign in Minnesota, like the work that we've done in New York City, we'd love to talk about it. You know, is there support for that? Whether that's public support or from private foundations to make this a real initiative in Minnesota. Stopping peaker plants, replacing them, stopping the advance of hydrogen in places where it shouldn't be. So that's what we're here for.
Great. Thank you so much, Seth, Shelley, and Abby, for putting this information in one place for us today and sharing your expertise and experience. Thank you to everyone else who is working diligently on all of these issues across Minnesota, and for joining us here today. We'll be sending out some follow-up information, and I hope you have a really good Wednesday.
Thanks for having us here. Thanks, everyone.